40, a few minutes delayed, but I thought we will allow all our dear friends to come in who have taken the trouble to attend the lecture today. This audience is very beloved because, we are resuming our Azim Premji University's public lecture series after more than 2.5 years. Some of you who attended our lectures before might recall that the last time we had our public lecture like this was in February 2020, and then the pandemic hit us. And it's a very special day that we decided that we will begin our lecture today. So those of you who've come here, very dear to us because you've braved the weather. To be honest, even as of Wednesday, our distinguished guest, Dr. Sanjaya Baru, and some of my colleagues were debating whether we should go ahead with this program given the weather conditions in Bangalore. But we thought we'd put in a lot of effort, and we thought Varuna Bhagwan will be a bit kind and hold off so we could do something today. So reasonably happy that we have, if not a full house, we have a well-sprinkled audience here. And I think the strength is not in numbers but in spirit. And therefore, for each one of you who's occupying a seat, you're actually occupying 3 in our hearts. So thank you very much. Actually, the public lecture series began in 2011, almost coinciding with the time when Azim Premji Foundation established the Azim Premji University. And since then, we've had a number of distinguished people come here, give us lectures. The venues may change from time to time. It's been at the Mother Tekla Auditorium earlier. It's been at the BIC. It's been at Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and other places. But the spirit and the core purpose is always the same, that as a foundation, we said, how do we bring a variety of views and discussions across to the public through the means of this public lecture series. So you can imagine how delighted we are that we have today the resumption of normal service, if I may use the expression, through the presence of Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Dr. Sanjaya Baru, as you all know, is a distinguished economist, political analyst, editor, and a prolific writer. He's been the editor of a number of leading publications and magazines, and also, as you well know, was the media advisor to our Prime Minister Manmohan Singh during UPA 1. If I read out correctly, he is now the Distinguished Fellow, United Service Institution of India. But all this is beside what I want to share with you, that Dr. Baru, through his prolific writings, has given us a number of books. All of you will readily recall his book on Narasimha Rao, former Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, and also Accidental Prime Minister, which he wrote, bringing it from his times when he was media advisor at the Prime Minister then. His latest book in 2022 is 75 Years of Indian Economy. And this is a book that is slim, but like all his other writings, lucid, jargon-free, and talks to the reader in a manner that is very special to Dr. Baru. He's got a style that connects with us, and it's the same style with which he speaks. Today, from his vantage ringside seat and deep understanding, he will talk to us on India and the world geopolitical and economic challenges. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Podium, in fact to Dr. Baru, and invite him over to speak to us, I cannot resist but mention that how gracious and readily he has agreed to be here with us. When I reached out to Dr. Baru and said, will you please come and resume services for us, do us the honor of being the first speaker after we resume our public lecture series, he replied to me in precisely 25 seconds on the email. And I'm not exaggerating. I pride myself on being reasonably prompt on emails, but he's in a league of his own. It's the same with our WhatsApp exchanges. So much of our exchanges in arranging all this has been done very simply through emails and WhatsApps. The one time when I spoke to him, he touched my heart, and I must mention this to you. I said, Dr. Baru, you're coming from Delhi, you're doing this lecture on Saturday. Do you mind, Sanjay, if you would talk to our students on Friday, which was yesterday? And Dr. Baru replied to me saying, Giridhar, I have never, ever refused an opportunity to speak to our students. So in addition to all those things I said to you about Dr. Baru, he's also teacher Baru. So over to you, Sanjay. Welcome here. And it's a pleasure and honor to welcome you. And you have a... It's very special, as I told you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for those very kind words and generous introduction. Those of you who are at the back may want to come a little forward so I can make some eye contact. I started my life as a teacher, and like all teachers, I insist on looking into my audience eyes, which is why when I was asked if I'd have a PowerPoint presentation, I said I never use PowerPoints. Power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. Because when you are using PowerPoint, the audience looks at the screen and not at the speaker. So I always value eye contact so that I know that I'm making sense. Otherwise, it's better to stop and go out and have a drink. Let me begin by saying that the reason I chose this particular topic for today's lecture is because once again, and I'll explain why I say once again, the link between our economic performance and our global challenges is becoming manifest. We went through a long period when we had a more or less inward-looking economy, reduced our dependence on the outside world, and tried to pursue economic growth more or less based on our own steam. Then we opened up in 1991 under the leadership of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh. And as has just been mentioned, I have a book called 1991, which goes into great detail in what happened just in that 1 year, from 1st January to 31st December. And as a consequence of that opening up, our relations with the world changed. The world itself changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Our most important strategic partner disappeared. We had to establish new relations with the outside world, and particularly with the United States, but also with the European Union, with Japan, with Korea, and with our neighbors, not just in South Asia, but in Asia as a whole. And therefore, it was a moment when geopolitics and economics came together in a very intimate manner. That's not the subject of my talk today, but I have a whole book on that, how the two played into each other in 1991. We were fortunate that from 1991 till 2025, for 25 years, we did reasonably well, better than we did in the previous 25 years. The world did reasonably well and became more and more welcoming. We established new relationships with the outside world, and those relationships helped us in strengthening our own economic capability. Bangalore, of course, one of the standing examples of the beneficiaries of that process. The Y2K challenge, the rise of the IT sector, the globalization of India's IT and software technology personnel, and the global discovery of India through IT. I remember when I went to China for the first time in 1994, very few of the Chinese I met were interested in talking to me about India. But when I went back in 2002, almost everybody would say, oh, Hindu, which is the Chinese for Indian. Hindu, I would say yes. IT. And I would say no. So Hindu became IT by 2002. And I then wrote a paper called The Strategic Consequences of India's Economic Performance, which then became the title of a book of essays. And it attracted global attention and attention in India and abroad. I was invited to speak on it all over the world because the world was beginning to understand that link between India's economic rise and its growing geopolitical importance. The concept of a rising India did not exist in the 20th century. It suddenly became a term that people started using again and again. And I'll give you 3 numbers I always ask students, especially in my audience, to always remember these three numbers. Actually, there are four numbers. The first number is that from 1900 to 1950, the first half of the 20th century, we grew by around 0.5, 0.7%. In the next 30 years, from 1950 to 1980, we grew at the rate of 3.5% average annual growth. From 1980 to 2000, we grew at the average annual growth rate of 5.5%. And from 2000 to 2015, it was 7.5%. 0.5, 3.5, 5.5, 7.5. That was the story of rising India. In the year 2007, a lifelong skeptic of India, Lee Kuan Yew, who was deeply disappointed by India for a variety of reasons, wrote an essay in the Forbes magazine in which he said that 21st century is Asia's century, and Asia is like a jet engine, like a jet plane, rising with two solid engines, China and India. 2007. Today, if you had a jet engine where one engine was India and one engine was China, the plane will go in circles. Because one engine is firing at $17 trillion of GDP, and we are at $3 trillion. This phenomenal growth of China, which was the same at the same stage in terms of GDP and general manufacturing and other capabilities in 1980. 40 years later is 5 times bigger than India. But even in 2007, we were seen as a rising India. Manmohan Singh used to often say in many of his speeches, the world wants India to do well, our problems are at home. That was the general understanding. And the world wanted India to do well for 2 reasons. One, because the world was becoming increasingly worried about China's rise and did not know how to deal with it. And 2, because India was a growing economy and India's market was growing, the market opportunities were growing, the investment opportunities were growing. And so the world wanted India to do well. But our problems were at home, whether it was education, urban development, infrastructure, law and order, inequality, etc., etc. All our problems are domestic. India's share of the share of trade in national income went up, almost doubled within a decade, going up to 50% by the turn of the century, or by 2010. India's share of world trade, merchandise trade, went up from 0.5% in 1990 to 2.5% by 2015. So here was a country that was rising rapidly, that was seen as catching up with China, that was seen as a great success story. And all of that was made possible by a global environment that was hospitable. And the interaction between global geopolitics and our economic development was such that it facilitated India's rise. Nobody saw India as a threat. In fact, that was the other point that Lee Kuan Yew made. He said, why is it that everybody is worried about China's rise, but nobody is worried about India's rise? And for someone like Lee Kuan Yew to say that was a significant remark. And that idea, resonated across the world. When George Bush met Manmohan Singh for the first time on the ramparts of the Kremlin in May 2005, the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, he introduced his wife to Manmohan Singh by saying, here is India's Prime Minister, he's a Sikh, that's why he wears a turban. His president is Muslim, his party president is Christian, and India has 80% Hindus. And it's a democracy, and they're doing well. And Laura Bush was kind of all smiles, and this was in the Kremlin with Putin and others all standing there, right? So that was, I call, the golden age for India. What has gone wrong? Why is it that I at least do not feel as confident today as I did at that point in time. And that will be the focus of my talk today. First of all, 3.5, 5.5, 7.5. In the last 5 years, there are different estimates, and someone like Dr. Chiranjeev Sen here probably give us a better lecture on those statistics. But whatever the differences in the numbers and the debate on the statistics, almost everybody has agreed that we have not recorded 7.5 average in the last 5 years. If anything, is more likely to be below 6%. The latest numbers, 2019 to 2023, is 3.8%, which includes the impact of COVID, it includes the impact of demonetization, it includes the impact of the war and the rising oil prices, et cetera, et cetera. So we are in bad number territory, and that's a matter of concern. Inflation is still high, unemployment levels are still high, and foreign exchange reserves are going down. Exports are not picking up, while imports are sharply rising. The current account deficit is rising. Fiscal deficit remains high despite GST collections, and the government's ability to spend is getting increasingly tightened. As a consequence, India's defense requirements are seriously come under challenge. As was mentioned in the introduction, I now am a fellow at the United Service Institution of India, which is India's oldest think tank. It's the think tank of the Indian Armed Forces. It's been around for 150 years. And some of our best senior people from the armed forces are there. And from what I hear from all of them, there's great concern within the Army, within the Navy, within the Air Force, of reduced financial allocation for defense. It has consequences. So fiscal impact on defense expenditure has geopolitical consequences. How do you deal with China? How do you deal with Pakistan? How do you deal with other pressures around? So there is a slowdown, a fiscal pressure, and what Keynes used to say, expectations are not particularly optimistic. And expectations make a difference, because if you expect tomorrow to be better, you end up spending more in the hope of earning more, and therefore tomorrow would be better because there is more spending, the economy picks up. If you expect tomorrow to be worse or not too good, you save, you cut down on your spending, you hold back on investment, and that reduces income. This is a simple idea from Keynes, and that is precisely the situation we are now caught in, where expectations shaped by this experience, demonetization, COVID, inflation, unemployment, this experience is, in my judgment, causing reduced expectations. I published a book last year, which was a set of essays called Post-COVID Indian Economy, in which I had people both from government and from outside write for the book. So I had Rajiv Kumar, who was Deputy Chairman of the Niti Aayog, Bibek Debroy, who was Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, Amitabh Kant, who was CEO of Niti Aayog. So the guys in government, so the book is not one-sided. I had all opinions in that book. But a central idea that comes through a lot of the essays that were published in that book was that uncertainty has gone up. There is a policy uncertainty index, which is computed by an outfit in the US. And if you see those numbers, it had sharply gone up. Unfortunately, I didn't write down those numbers, but if you look at that book, I have produced the data. Now, given this wider economic situation, how does the contemporary geopolitical situation impact it? Just as the world economy was recovering from COVID and the uncertainty generated by COVID, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has had two or three consequences for the global economy. The first and the most important consequence was the increase in oil prices. The increase in oil prices at any point in time results in a one-time loss of income of the country that is dependent on imported oil. So when oil prices went up from $77 per barrel to $120 per barrel within a space of 2 months, you can imagine the total loss of national income India felt, because India is dependent for imported oil for 80 to 90%. 80 to 90% of all our oil is imported. And just a sharp increase in oil price resulted in a collapse of India's national income, because that money has just gone out importing the oil. That was a direct consequence. Fortunately, the increase in food prices that happened as a result of the invasion did not directly impact us as much, because our agricultural situation was better and we were not dependent on imported wheat or rice or other commodities as much. We even tried to export some. The second impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the imposition of economic sanctions by the United States, European Union, and Japan. Primarily the United States. Almost every single sanction, the first step was taken by the US. Next morning, EU would respond. By next evening, Japan would respond. So the agenda was set by the US. And US would arm twist. Fortunately for US, Angela Merkel lost the election and Scholz came in, and Scholz was someone whose arms could be twisted, unlike that of Angela Merkel, and Germany fell in line. Fortunately for the US, Shinzo Abe stepped down, Kishida became prime minister, Suga was defeated, and Kishida is another politician whose arms could be twisted. So you now have, of course in London you have had a joker whose arms and legs could be twisted, and finally is out. And the same in Australia. So all these allies had weak leaders, and the US twisted all their arms and made sure that the sanctions that they had devised, systematically devised. There are now very good studies on the conceptualization and implementation of the economic sanctions. They were aimed at crippling the Russian economy directly, but the global impact was phenomenal. I mentioned earlier what was called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. As a consequence of the economic sanctions imposed by the US, the index number of the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index went up from 222 in the year 2021, before the war, to 316 in 2022 till June, first half of 2022, January to June. So from 222, the number went up to 316. Now, just as a digression, how is this index constructed? What this institution does in the US is to look at the incidence of the word uncertainty and reportage and commentary on uncertainty across the world in all major publications. So they take the top 3 or 4 newspapers and magazines in the US, in Europe, in Japan, all the major OECD countries, and look at how uncertainty is being reported. There's a sharp increase. More and more people are talking about uncertainty or writing about uncertainty, then the index numbers goes up. So there's an increase from 222 to 316. Now, the indirect effect of these measures was to create global uncertainty, because countries were not sure. We were told, don't buy Russian oil. We were told, don't pay for it in dollars. Other companies around the world were told, if you sell or buy anything from Russia, then you cannot sell or buy anything from us. So everybody started hedging, and that again increased global uncertainty. Then for the first time for the first time in history, a central bank was targeted by the Basel, Bank of International Settlements, which blacklisted the Russian central bank and said nobody outside of Russia can deal with the Russian central bank. And the significance of this is that right through the Second World War, the Bank of International Settlements did not target German central bank. Hitler was not targeted, but Putin was targeted. So you had, a horrific war, and yet Hitler could, continue to do his monetary transactions with the rest of the world, while Putin was prevented from conducting these financial transactions. The SWIFT system came under doubt, though there has been some softening and stepping back on that. All of this, if you talk to people who are in the business of thinking about conflict, they have now come around to the conclusion that we are now in an era of what chaps in forces call gray zone conflict. In other words, war is not being conducted through actual armed engagement. No US soldier is dying, whether in Russia or anywhere. The US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, it has stepped out of Middle East. There is no American soldier dying. But the American system is squeezing countries around the world. And therefore, economic instruments are being used as weapons. I think it was Raghuram Rajan who coined that phrase, as weapons of mass destruction, WMD, like chemical weapons and nuclear weapons. Economic instruments are being used as weapons of mass destruction. That's Raghuram Rajan's phrase. So we are in an era of gray zone conflict. And the judgment today is that we will remain in this era for the foreseeable future. Certainly for the next 2-3 years, but maybe even more. What will that do to the Indian economy? How will it impact our relations with different countries? These are extremely challenging times, and maneuvering our way through this world is going to be, it's real test for Indian political, intellectual, bureaucratic, diplomatic, and business leadership. Because for the first time again after Second World War, we are now in an era of what is called great power contestation. The three great powers, US, Russia, and China, have decided to settle, who's number one, who's number two, who's number three. And they're not going to back off. We don't expect this so-called great power contestation to end anytime soon. It has not come overnight. It has been coming in the last few years. The first signal was what economists call the decoupling of the US-China economic relationship, the trade war that Donald Trump launched against China and trying to decouple from China, having contributed to China's rise. Once again, every now and then I'll do a commercial. So my next commercial, I edited a book that came out last year, which is called The New Cold War, Henry Kissinger and the Rise of China. And I invited writers from major countries around the world, from US, Germany, France, UK, Japan, Korea, Russia, India, Singapore, Australia. I even invited a Chinese scholar to write. He couldn't deliver on time. But I put together a set of essays written by very, very senior people. One of them was an advisor to former Prime Minister of Australia. Another was an advisor to the former, to Putin, in fact, in Russia. Guys like that. Fascinating essays. And the point that almost everybody makes is that China's rise is thanks to the United States. From 1971, it is US investment, it is US favoring China, bringing it into the Security Council, increasing its shareholding in the IMF and the World Bank, treating China like a normal power, giving trade preferences, and even on occasion siding with China against India, as happened in Bangladesh war. The US and China had a honeymoon. And Mr. Henry Kissinger started an organization called Henry Kissinger Associates, which was full of people who either were working for companies and then went into government and came into this outfit, or were working in government, went into some company and came into this outfit, or were working in some university or think tank, joined this outfit, then went into government or into some company. It was a circular flow between government, business, and think tanks in Washington. Every one of them was funded by China. The top think tanks in Washington, Brookings, Carnegie, Paulson Institute in Chicago, all funded by Chinese business. So the America-China relationship was such that in the year 2000 or 2002, if I remember right, Fred Bergsten, who heads the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs titled G2. Can America and China come together and form a condominium and run the world? Eastern hemisphere belongs to China, Western hemisphere belongs to America. We two get together and run the world. And Europe and Latin America and Africa, parts of Africa will listen to us, Asia and parts of Africa and East Asia, they will listen to you, and you and I run the world. These were ideas floated. Seriously, in respected journals, like Foreign Affairs is a highly respected journal. Anyway, so that was the world we were in, and suddenly we came out of it during Trump's time, and Biden has continued with that. So the first thing is delinking with China. Second step is to isolate Russia. Putin was reaching out to the West saying, don't take Ukraine into NATO, leave Ukraine as a neutral power, and allow me to build bridges with Europe. I can go on telling stories, so at some point you'll have to ask me to shut up. But when I start lecturing, I go into stories. So I was in Moscow for a conference which is annually held by an outfit called Valdai Club, where Putin sits through the day. So it's a group of people from all over the world, and the president is sitting there and listening and talking, etc. It's a unique kind of conference. And the focus that year, I think it was in 2019, before COVID, was on Russia and Asia. That was the topic of the day. Whole day, everybody is talking about Russia's relations with Asia. In the evening, we had dinner. The food was French cuisine, and the music playing while the food was being served was American jazz. So I said to my Russian host, you guys talk about Asia, but at the end of the day, you are West. You love French food, you love French wine, you love American jazz. You're part of the West. And he said, yes, we want to be part of the West. But the West rejects us. Because the fear in the US is, now I have to go into history, but I don't want to go too much into history. The Second World War was a dividing line between the relations between Europe and the US. Till the Second World War, US was dependent on Europe. In ways which are quite unimaginable today. The entire defense industry in Europe was supplying for American armed forces. The US hardly had a defense industry. It was because the Second World War began that overnight the Americans started producing arms because they could not ship these arms. European arms were going into war with Germany and Poland the first 2 years before the Americans got into the war. And then they started manufacturing. They had an aircraft industry which was civilian, they made it into military. But more importantly, a bulk of the investment going into US in the period from 1900 to 1930, 1940, all European investment. The Europeans were investing in America's rise, just as America invested in China's rise, right? But after the Second World War,
the US became the dominant power and took charge of Europe, of Western Europe, created NATO, put American troops in Germany, in Britain, and brought in a nuclear umbrella over Germany. And their fear has always been that if Europe moves closer to Russia, then American influence in Europe will go down. So it's really a fight for influence in Europe between Russia and the US. We have nothing to do with it, which is why, Jaishankar said famously, I think went viral on Twitter, he said, you Europeans think your problems are world's problems, right? And he was absolutely right in saying that, because this was Europe's problem. Whether America is more influential in Germany or Russia is more influential in Germany is their headache. Why should we get involved in that fight? And the Americans for 10 years were telling the Germans, don't buy more gas from Russia, don't buy more oil from Russia. But Angela Merkel said, look, I need gas, I need oil. Britain has oil, Norway has oil. I don't have energy. I'm the most important economy in Europe. So where do I get my oil and gas from? I'll get it from Russia. And so the pipelines were built, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. And this is what was sought to be sabotaged by the United States, so that Europe will now turn to the US for oil and gas, or turn to the Middle East for oil and gas. America had another problem in the Middle East. See how things get connected. Everything gets connected to everything. In Middle East over the last 10 years, the demand for oil from the West was going down, while the demand for oil from East was going up. So China, Japan, Korea, India became the dominant 4 consumers of Middle Eastern, or what we call West Asian oil. No longer Europe, no longer United States. United States had become self-sufficient in energy, and Europe was getting more and more from Russia. And Russia and the Saudis came together, were dividing the oil market between themselves. So the Americans were again worried. If the Middle East finds, or West Asia finds, that their markets are all in the East, they'll move closer to India, they'll move closer to China, they'll move closer to Korea, to Japan. What will happen to our interests in the region? Because the Americans have bases in Bahrain, they have bases all over the region. They fought wars to retain that control. So each of these global incidents is getting tied up, but the net impact of all that, one is oil, that I've already mentioned. But the second impact, which is equally significant, is the end of globalization. The collapse of the World Trade Organization, which has not been able to move in the last 22 years. The last successful ministerial meeting was held at Doha, where a Doha development round was launched, and it never really fulfilled its agenda, and as a result of which multilateral trade system has become dysfunctional. Just because the Russians went into Ukraine, the US said, no, let us try and see if we can revive WTO. There was a ministerial meeting, nothing came out of it. Everybody said it's a success, but nobody answered the question, what did you get out of it? The only thing they got out of it was a deal on fishing, which benefits some European countries. And India was unhappy even with that deal. So how are countries responding to this? They are responding through regionalization of trade. So you have a regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia involving all the Asian economies, and India walked out of it. India walked out of it saying that they don't want to be part of a trading organization in which China is a dominant player. That was the official reason. But the unofficial reason was that if we had been members of RCEP, we would have had to accept export of dairy products from Australia and New Zealand. And the Gujarat dairy industry rose up in revolt saying they'll defeat Narendra Modi and Amit Shah if these two Gujaratis sitting in Delhi allow Australian and New Zealand dairy products to be imported into the Indian market, which is why Amit Shah became Minister for Cooperatives. Suddenly, overnight, home and cooperatives. And if you read newspapers, every other day he speaks about the cooperative sector. Because it's the cooperative sector, the dairy sector, the great creation of V. Kurian, where we thought, oh, we are self-sufficient in milk, we are self-sufficient in paneer, We are self-sufficient in dairy products. But we can't compete with Australia and New Zealand. They have more cows and which yield more milk and better technology to turn those products out, right? So we opted out of RCP. Then the Japanese said, okay, let's try to create something else, so that the Americans can come and keep the Chinese out. And they said, we'll got comprehensive trade partnership, something CPTPP, I forget the full name, so CTPPP, one of those 4 5-letter word constructs. After that was floated, America said, no, we don't want to enter because we are having problems at home. All the workers in America are voting for Trump. If we now get into another trade deal, those workers will again vote back Trump. So Biden said, nothing doing, I'm not getting into this. The Chinese sent a letter to the Japanese saying, we are willing to join. Please give us membership. And the Japanese didn't know what to do, so China's application is pending. But we are not in that. We are not in RCP, we are not in CTPP, whatever. The Americans then said, no, let us try and form another group. We'll call it the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which will look at trade, it will look at supply chains, it will look at technology, et cetera, et cetera. The ministers met 3 days back, and this morning's newspapers, you would have all seen the news. India walked out of the trade talks. They said, okay, we'll do other things, but not trade. So our situation is becoming difficult by the day. Our share of world trade is going down. The way it went up, there's a reversal. Finally, what about global institutions? The United Nations Security Council has been completely made irrelevant after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nobody talks to anybody, nothing gets voted. Because all the 3 contenders, Russia, China, America, are all 3 veto powers. So each one vetoes the other, and therefore nothing happens. Multilateral institutions, the Chinese created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Board and the BRICS New Development Bank, but the Chinese economy is in trouble after COVID. So they're not able to give enough money to these institutions to pump money out. IMF, World Bank, the less said the better. Not only have their resources shrunk, their capacities have shrunk, their leadership has become mediocre. There's a woman called Kristalina Georgieva who lobbied her way to become head of the IMF. From whatever I know of her, one of the most incompetent MDs the fund has ever had. And so on and so forth. So then we have G20. G20 was the last successful international organization because it solved the 2008-2009 transatlantic financial crisis by creating new institutions, new funding systems, to then revive the financial sector in Europe, to revive the financial sector in the US, and to generally revive global economic growth. And it had 3 successful summits in Washington, Pittsburgh, and London. So everybody said, my God, finally we got some group that now works. This is the executive board of the global system, and the G20 will now provide leadership. After 2015, the G20 has done nothing. Indonesia is now going to host the G20 summit in October. Nobody knows who will attend it, because Putin has said, I'll attend it, and the rest of the world doesn't know what to do. The Americans don't know whether they should be there, the Europeans don't know whether they should be there, the Japanese don't know whether they should be there. So the Indonesians are saying, no, he will come into the room for a few minutes when all of you can be out, then you can come into the room and he'll be out, It's a pantomime act. And next year we are hosting G20. If the Indonesian summit fails, I I mean, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. You know, as it is, I've said a lot of stuff which is not particularly optimistic. If the G20 summit this year fails in Indonesia, I'm not sure it will survive beyond that. Unless the great power contestation gets some resolution, unless the West is willing to accommodate Putin, unless they come to some kind of an understanding that, all right, you take half of Ukraine, leave the other half, and that will not join NATO. Some compromise formula on Ukraine, which Biden will find very difficult till his own election is over, which is in 2024. And we are hosting G20 in 2023. To expect that the Americans will compromise with Putin before Biden's next election, I mean, I know something about politics. It doesn't work that way, right? So a lot of money is being spent in Delhi. Those of you who travel to Delhi will see lots of constructions happening. We are building new hotels, conference facilities, et cetera, et cetera. It will be interesting to see how many of those rooms are occupied. Finally, let me say that the Indian response to all this was, in my judgment, a positive and sensible response, which was Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. I have nothing against Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan. In fact, Make in India was a program launched by Manmohan Singh. In 2006, he set up the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council under the chairmanship of V. Krishnamurthy, and they produced a report called National Strategy for Manufacturing, which was made public in 2000 and, I don't know, 8 or little after that. And then the 12th five-year plan had a chapter called National Manufacturing Strategy, incorporating all those ideas. So it was all there. The ideas are all there. When Prime Minister Narendra Modi took over and closed down the Planning Commission, the 12th plan died. But one chapter of the 12th plan was picked up by Amitabh Kant, who was then the industry secretary, who understood the relevance of that chapter, and that was converted into Make in India strategy. So Make in India is essentially an old idea, which is a sensible idea, which is because the share of manufacturing in national income has stagnated at 16 to 17% over the last 25 years. And the whole objective of that strategy, of the original national manufacturing strategy and the Make in India strategy, is to increase the share of manufacturing from 16% or 17% to 25%. Right? So India has to have a manufacturing sector. The second element of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan was indigenization of defense manufacturing. No major power in the world is dependent on imported defense equipment. No major power. Not Russia, not China, not United States, not even some of the smaller fellows like Brazil and Turkey, which have their own defense manufacturing capabilities. Our dependence has remained high. I have advocated indigenization of defense manufacturing for 20 years. I used to be a member of the National Security Advisory Board from 1999 to 2001 when Prime Minister Vajpayee was there. Rakesh Mohan and I were the two chaps with an economics background who were made members, and we wrote the chapter on defense industry, saying that India cannot continue to have a defense an armed force dependent on imported defense manufacturing. And as I've already said earlier, fiscal pressures are such that money is not there. So get in the private sector, which we did. All good policy initiatives. But they're not yet bearing fruit. Hopefully they will bear fruit. Hopefully share of manufacturing will go up in national income. Hopefully indigenization of defense manufacturing will happen. But again, this morning I read in the newspapers that sources, unnamed sources in the government, and it's a serious news report which I take seriously, said that unnamed sources in the government are saying
that this indigenization program is too ill-planned. If tomorrow there is a confrontation with either China or Pakistan, we will desperately need imports. We don't have enough equipment at home, and our main supplier, or not main, but main and major supplier, Russia, needs all the equipment it has to fight its own war. It's going to say, boss, sorry, this time no money. I'm fighting my own war. I can't spare anything for you. Then you'll have to go around the world, running around the world, looking for guns and tanks and jets and bullets and, all the stuff. So let me conclude by saying that the economic and geopolitical challenges have once again come together. And the resolution of this takes us back to 1950, to the first plan, the second plan, and Jawaharlal Nehru, which is to put Manmohan Singh on his head, which is said, Manmohan Singh, as I said, you say world wants India to do well, our challenges are at home. Now we have to say, the world doesn't care how India does, we have to bother about our own interests, which is what 1950 was. Nehru went to America for help. Nehru did not reject the US. He traveled to the US, asked for US investments. The US said, no, I'm busy investing in Germany, I'm busy investing in Japan, they are war-torn economies, I'm trying to revive these, they are my allies now, I don't have money for you. So he came back to India, because the West did not have interest in India. Then we went to the Soviets, who helped us, who set up a public sector, created the core public sector. But today they don't have that capacity. Then we thought we'll do business with China and do it's a growing economy, and that will help us. Now we've got problems with China. So we are in a difficult world where once again, as in 1950, we go back to Atmanirbharta. The idea is originally of the national movement, and that's the book I'll end with my last commercial, which is that I've just published a book called 75 Years of India's Economic Journey, in which the first 2 chapters are devoted exactly to this issue, which is the kind of thinking that shaped India's economic policy in the first decade. And I surveyed the entire literature of that period, which includes things like the Bombay Plan, which was written by leaders of Indian business, J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Lala Shriram, Purushottam Das, Thakur Das. I looked at M.N. Roy's People's Plan, Subhash Chandra Bose and Nehru's National Planning Committee proceedings. You look at all the ideas. And I was saying yesterday when I lectured to the students at Azim Premji, you go back even further. In 1896, Swami Vivekananda went to Japan on his way to Chicago. Now, all of us have grown up being told about Swamiji's visit to Chicago and his address to the Parliament of Religions. Every Indian knows about that. How many of us know about his observations on Japan? Because he spent time in Japan. And then he boarded a ship from Japan to the US, and one of his companions on the ship was Jamsetji Tata. So Swami Vivekananda said to Jamsetji Tata, you're a businessman, look at these Japanese. They were like us, an agrarian economy 70 years ago. They had their Meiji Restoration and there's the revival of their economy. Today they are an industrial power. We must learn from Japan. You go back to India and set up a steel mill. Jamsetji Tata came back and wrote a letter to Swami Vivekananda. I'm not only setting up a steel mill, I'm going to fund an Indian Institution of Science in Bengaluru. It's on record. That is when the idea of investing in IIS goes back all the way to that. Then in 1906, another person linked to Bangalore went to Japan, Mokshagundam Vishweshwaraya. And he came back and wrote an essay. And he gave the slogan to the Congress party, saying, industrialize or perish. Japan should be the model for India. Look at this Asian country, agrarian, traditionally, culturally traditional, very conservative. It not only has industrialized, but when Vishveshwaraya was writing in 1906, the year before that, in 1905, Japan became the first Asian nation to defeat a European nation, which was Russia. Russia lost to Japan in the 1905 war. So these are, I take my readers back to that period, saying the ideas are not new. You don't need today's new ideas. Just go back to these old ideas and simply do. Thank you.
For question and answers with Dr. Baru. He did a plug for his book, but let me add a plug also. Most of us, if you'll pardon me for saying so, know him as an author of The Accidental Prime Minister more than anything else. That's been the noisiest, and that's fun. But his latest book, 75 Years of Indian Economy, is just 155 pages. It's a slim book, and I want to read from the last paragraph of a review because I liked it. Baru paints a vast canvas in a mere 155 pages in this lucid, jargon-free book where data is kept to the minimum. Those 4 things that you mentioned only. This book is a must-read for the post-millennial generation interested in the political economy of independent India's 75-year journey. So he's writing it for the people who were born 1995, 2000 onwards. So I guess it'll be very accessible and in his usual lucid, jargon-free style. I'll now open the floor to questions. He's a consummate teacher and experienced man, so you will take it over and manage the questions yourself. Huh? It's just that we don't have time.
Yeah.
Dr.
Please go
Baru,
ahead.
what is it that ails India in both the defense manufacture or even in the field of education? Why do tens of thousands of students have to go abroad to do their medicine, their engineering, their MBA, their PhDs, their masters? Why can't we create medical institutions in India, engineering colleges in India? What is lacking? Or even, for example, an assault rifle. We still can't make an assault rifle. We have to make the Russian AK-47 in India. AK-47 was made in the year 1947, and we still can't do reverse engineering to make the AK-47
I'll take
in
3
India.
questions at a time, and if you can just ask questions, that will be helpful because we'll run out of time. I'll take 3 at a time and answer. Yes, sir. Here, please give her the mic and... No, you got the mic.
Dr. Baru, excellent lecture. Thank you very much. Now, you said let's just do it. What, according to you, is the most significant barrier which we need to cross? Is it a cultural barrier? Is it a political barrier? What exactly is the barrier which is preventing us from moving ahead? Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Good evening, sir, and thanks for your incomparable speech and enlightening us about the present situations. What I wanted to know is, like, what do you foresee for India, and where do we stand, and is it now heading towards the right direction, and how will the future of India be, especially to the present generation? What will their future be?
So let me just take these 3 questions and then I'll come to the next 3. Well, in a sense, one idea is linked to all 3, which is our neglect of education. We are the only country in this part of the world. That is, if you take all the countries to our east, all the countries, all the way up to Japan, their educational investments and attainments are superior to ours. We have neglected education. The first politician in this country who has made education, school education, his calling card is Arvind Kejriwal. He's the first chief minister who's saying, vote for me because I am giving you good quality government school education.
No chief minister, no political leader, including when the left was in power in Bengal. And for Kerala's attainments, it's, the long history. It's not just one political party. Kerala has had a long history of investing in education. But if you leave Kerala aside, in the rest of India, no one focused on education. And that huge gap was filled in by the private sector. Politicians in power, instead of creating public education, use their power to create private education. So every medical college is owned by a politician. Every private engineering college is owned by a politician. You take in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana, everywhere, private education is in the hands of political leaders. So that is India's biggest failure. And I'm not the first one to say it. I mean, come on, we have had Amartya Sen write about this 30 years back. And most recently, my friend Surjit Bhalla, who's a great fan of the current Prime Minister, wrote a book on human capital, education, etc. Everybody who knows anything about economics in this country knows that the neglect of education is the cornerstone of a lot of our problems. You have 20,000 Indians stuck in Ukraine studying, But it's not the only country. You go to Kyrgyzstan, you go to Kazakhstan. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Indian students all over the world. And yesterday or day before, the US Embassy reported that this is the year Indians are the single largest applicants for education in the United States, right? So we are going all over the world. Because here, facilities are not adequate. So neglect of investment. But apart from neglect of investment, and to some extent, young people want to travel. I have nothing against that. They want to go out and get away from home. And if they can afford it, they'll go abroad. But I think there is also the fact that we have not built brands, except the IITs and the IIMs. I mean, my school, Hyderabad Public School, acquired its brand when one of its students became head of some American multinational. Satya Nadella became chairman of Microsoft. Everybody said, oh, Hyderabad Public School, great. Why? Because that fellow went and got a job in America. There are lots of us around in this country doing stuff nobody bothers, right? So there is this foreign craze in this country. The middle class in India is like that, as they say, like that only. Now, look, you should ask them. I'm not in the government. What are they doing? Please ask them. They will tell you. What is the barrier? This is the barrier. This is the main barrier that we face today of inadequacy of skills. Let me give you another number. Labor productivity. One of the key factors contributing to China's rise as a manufacturing factory of the world is high labor productivity. For a long time, Western economists said, oh, because they're using prison labor, they starve their workers, they make them work for 20 hours a day, etc., etc. That's not, that may be partly there, but that's not the whole answer. I visited factories in China. I have not seen starving workers. I've seen well-fed workers. I've seen creches for their children, well-fed children in those creches. But productivity is higher because they're better educated. They understand the technology they're using. So productivity of labor is linked to skill development. We launched a skill development mission. I briefly, for 1 year, I had a job called Secretary General of FICCI. And during that period, I said, what is happening to the skill development mission? Who was the minister, at least in that year when I was there? Rushdie Pratap Rudy. I mean, you put an nincompoop as a minister for skill development. What do you get? That's finally on the direction, ma'am. This is one country in different directions. Different parts of the country are going in different directions. Let's see where all of it comes together in 2024. Right now, we are not going in the right direction. This is a great setback for India's economic growth, that social stability at home, which was the foundation
of our development from 50 till 2015. That has been shaken. Yes, sir.
So I just wanted to add possibly a positive thing I wanted to comment on. I recently read reports. Several countries, because of their demographic profile change and lack of willing labor, are opening up their economy for factor flows, especially labor flows. I read about Germany a couple of days back. Singapore is doing it. That's one part. The second part is a lot of these services for which people used to go out has become tradable services thanks to IT. Do you see a brighter side to that in spite of all the closing up which is happening because of these demographic changes and the tradable nature of services more and more scope for India?
Certainly, I mean, sitting in Bangalore, you cannot disagree with what you've just said. This is an example of a success story, or Hyderabad for that matter. There are pockets of development and growth, haphazard, not properly planned, which is what happens all the time, but nevertheless growth, injecting purchasing power into the system. And the South has now sucked in labor power from the rest of the country. Right? There is no place you can go to either in Bangalore or Chennai or Hyderabad without hearing Hindi or Gujarati or Bengali or Assamese. All the people from backward parts of the country are coming here to the south. This is one engine of growth. The tragedy is this has been the engine of growth for the last 120 years. I mentioned earlier the period from 1900 to 1950, when the average rate of growth of the Indian economy was 0.5%. That was an average. Guess which parts of the country were above average, even then? Madras Presidency, Bombay Presidency, and Punjab region. These were the three exceptions. They were rising above the national average. Which were below the national average? Bengal Presidency, United Provinces, Central Provinces. Today also is the same story, which is why the Finance Minister of Tamil Nadu is saying, we are the engine of growth and we are giving you money for development of the north, right? So there is some development happening here. I mean, I'm not, that's the positive part of the story. Services sector growth is happening thanks to IT, thanks to export of service, labor power. Kerala has benefited hugely from the export of labor power to West Asia. And which is why our stance in the WTO right from beginning, from 1995, has been that we want to make trade in labor power part of the multilateral trading agreement, which nobody has agreed to, even today. It's not a part of multilateral trading system. There are no rules for it. Tomorrow morning, 5 million Indians in the Gulf can be thrown out. There's nothing you can do about it, except go to war, right? The US, which is sucking in Indians, can tomorrow deny visa to all of them and say, go home. You're not the only source of labor power. There are other countries that are competing with you. China, of course, was a big competitor. There were more Chinese in the United States till last year. Only this year, more Indians are getting visas than Chinese. You walk around any American university campus, you'll hear more Chinese Americans than Indian Americans. The Chinese went in millions into America. And many of them went back, some of them stayed on. Filipinos in the service sector. So there's a small microscopic area of financial services and information technology enabled services, ITs, where we have done well, and that has contributed to the development of a part of our country. Gurgaon, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Pune, they are the three major urban centers. Beyond that, now I was astounded, I don't know what Chiranjeev thinks, I was astounded to read my friend Dr. Lord Meghnad Desai, with whom I co-edited a book a couple of years back on the Bombay plan, say the other day in an interview on television
that India should forget manufacturing and only be a services-led economy. I mean, I don't know the logic of that argument. You cannot only be. And finally, this services economy is dependent on the growth of other economies. Suppose demand for your services goes down because the United States has developed new technologies that doesn't require these services. Artificial intelligence is a major source of threat to the thousands of Bangaloreans in the IT-enabled services sector. AI can wipe them all out of the market. Call centers, this, that, etc. So you are becoming vulnerable. A little amount of vulnerability is okay. I mean, I'm not one of those who believes in autarky and protecting ourselves from all vulnerabilities. That is ridiculous. But we should have some balances. So if in services you are excessively externally dependent, then in other areas you have to be domestically more self-reliant. And certainly I think manufacturing is one of them.
Hi, Dr. Varu. So I would like to make a note on Make in India or the Atmanirbhar scheme that you mentioned. So I myself work as in an industry which tries to modernize Indian industries. Okay, and I've seen in the last maybe a decade or so, there's a huge improvement in the products that are being manufactured in India and sold abroad, but still not meeting the norms because until you reach the quality norms, you really can't sell there, and that's the reason what you said. The trade deficit is high because they are not taking our products. So the Atmanirbhar scheme or whatever you call it, a Make India, is showing a baby steps as of now. But I know there's a big challenge. So I would like to know what's the challenge you see going forward from now? Because this is there to stay, and as you rightly mentioned, even when you said Lord Mignan this side made a statement, I think it's a foolish statement to make, right? You cannot be dependent on service. You have to depend on manufacturing. So your intake or your input on that. Thank you.
This is a very important question because we are saying manufacturing sector, Make in India, etc. The West is itself dealing with the problem of a shrinking manufacturing sector. For a long time, they ignored the problem as long as American companies were able to relocate into China, manufacture in China, and bring products back home. When you look at China's trade surplus, it's a product of American investment in China using Chinese labor to produce products, whether it's shoes or Apple iPhones, whatever, and bring them back and sell them in the global market. That was the model that worked till the US declared a trade war on China. But today, the politics in the West is that the working class in the United States, the working class in Europe is no longer willing to accept that. So Trump coming to power or Biden coming to power was because they are concerned about loss of jobs at home. And if we become more and more globally competitive, it's not like what China went through from 1980 to 2010. It had 30 years of growth based on export to the rest of the world. Taiwan did the same thing, Korea did the same thing, Japan did the same thing. My worry is that if we move in that direction now, we will come up against these barriers. And I'll tell you one reason for my worry. You must have read in the newspapers that India and the United Kingdom are negotiating a free trade agreement. UK-India free trade agreement. The negotiations are going on. And Boris Johnson and Narendra Modi set a date that by Diwali 2022, the FTA will be signed. So that remains the commitment of the British Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister, that by Diwali, the UK-India FTA will be signed. So I started reading on this and went to the internet and Googled and found that the British government has come out with a document, a 20-30 page document on India-EU FTA, explaining to the British people the benefits of this FTA. And what does it say? We will make India comply with A, B, C, D in order for India to be able to export to us so that our workers will not be threatened. So we'll make sure that India does not use child labor. We'll make sure that Indian working class gets the same benefits as British working class. We'll make sure that Indian factories have the same environmental standards as British environmental standards, etc., etc., etc. So when I read all that, I said, okay, this is for British government to get parliamentary approval. It is telling its parliament and its people that don't worry, we'll do this FTA, but it will not hurt us. It will benefit us. So I called up a very responsible gentleman in our government in Delhi, who happened to be a former colleague of mine, and I asked him, boss, do we have a document at home? So he said, are you mad? You've been around for a long time, you think we can put anything like this in writing? So I said, you're negotiating an FTA with no document. I mean, some journalist or parliamentarian should ask, what is our negotiating brief? What are we telling our people? Why we want this FTA? What is it? What are the benefits we'll get? I'm sure there will be benefits. I'm not saying, but at least the British are telling their people what will be the benefits of an FTA with India, which includes labor standards, which we rejected in the WTO, adherence to environmental standards, which we rejected in the WTO, human rights, which we rejected in the WTO, all the issues which we rejected in the WTO, saying they have nothing to do with trade. We call them non-trade issues. The British have said in an official document to the British government that they will include this in the India-UK FTA. No newspaper is writing about this. No political party is talking about this. Everybody says, Diwali tak ho jayega. Kya ho jayega? I've even written an article. I wrote an article the other day in Times of India. It appeared last week. I don't know if any one of you read it. I wrote an edit page column in Times of India pointing that there's a British document which is making statements that these commitments have to be made. Are we ready to do so? No reply. Nobody has taken it forward. We are living in an environment where nobody wants to ask difficult questions. And when they are asked, nobody wants to answer them. And that's the UK-India FTA. Then there's the EU-India FTA, which is also being negotiated. And the history of, I mean, I don't know if anyone has interest in trade policy, but if you're interested, the history of India-EU FTA is even worse. Because Europeans are even more fetishistic about green energy, environmental pollution, labor welfare. There are more kind of socialist governments in Europe than in Britain. And in Britain right now you have a conservative government. So when that is done, what will happen? Which is why this morning's paper says India walked out of the IPEF trade talks. So what is the headline? The headline is India agrees to 3 or 4 pillars of IPF. Achha, 3 out of 4, good. And my friend Piyush Goyal will come and do a song and drama on television, etc., and say, hey, 3 out of 4 we have agreed. Why 4 is the real thing, which is trade. You have not agreed. Why have you not agreed? Because the Americans are saying the same thing. Social issues, labor standards, environmental standards. Now imagine you're a young manufacturer, you're telling me, suppose I impose these standards on you in Bangalore. Will you be able to be globally competitive? What is your carbon emission of your factory? What is the health insurance for your workers? What is the pension you are giving your workers? What, social environment, these are the issues. Because developed countries have these guarantees for their working class, which we have not given to the entire working class in this country, and we are not capable of. Because many Indian companies will shut down if they start giving all of this. So the challenges are serious. That is why I'm saying, let's go back to 1950. Thoda Atmanirbharta is good. I mean, that's the best slogan I've heard in the last 7 years in this country.
Good evening, sir. My question is a little different. does personal rapport between the heads of state have any real-time significant impact on foreign policy and international relations? And or
Zero.
it's a PR exercise and they just go on
Totally.
to whatever? Zero?
Zero. Nothing to do with personal relations.
Okay.
International relations have nothing to do with personal relations. You can have excellent personal relations, and yet a political leader of any country has to defend his national interests. And that's what it has to do. If it serves the national interests of both sides, of course, they can get along well. But all this hugging doesn't make much difference.
Good evening, sir. So, sir, you mentioned about Henry Kissinger, and recently I believe he has given a statement in the World Economic Forum regarding how Americans are treating the whole Russian thing. So he mentioned about, settling on Ukraine and all of that, but there's a lot of red tape from the American side. So I'd want your comments on that. The second question is about regional organizations like SCU, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BIMSTEC, and their utility in our economic future. And the third question I'd like to ask you is about the manufacturing sector. Like you mentioned, like India in its evolution, we have skipped the whole manufacturing phase by quite a bit. So what would you suggest about that? And like how can we maybe do something about that? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, on the third question, I will not answer now because there may be others, because I've already actually spoken about that, and then my latest book has a whole chapter on that. But let me answer the first two, because actually that's related to today's lecture, and I'm glad you asked both those questions on Kissinger and India's involvement with regional groups. Kissinger is a European. He is born in Europe. He thinks like a European. If you read Kissinger, his entire worldview is of a European worldview. So he was very relevant for an America that, after the Second World War, sought to maintain control over Europe. So American political leadership, which basically is always inward-looking. I mean, American political leaders rarely have interest in the outside world, right? Found Kissinger extremely useful because he educated them on Europe. And Europe is the most important part of the world for the United States, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. Having said that, since Kissinger thinks like a European, he understands that bringing Russia into Europe and separating Russia's links with China makes sense. This is exactly what we have been saying. What has the Indian argument been? Indian argument is Russia and China are coming together. That's not good for India. So we don't want these two Eurasian powers to come together. And we have been supporting Russia in the hope that Russia will not be too dependent on China, and it will have other friends like us so that it can balance its dependence on China. That is Kissinger's view. Don't push Putin into a corner where he then becomes so dependent on China, which is a much bigger economy. I mean, China is 5 times bigger than us. It is 10 times bigger than Russia, right? And China can buy up the whole of Russia tomorrow morning. So that's what Kissinger has said on how America should approach the Ukraine issue is correct. And I think Kissinger has utter contempt for Democratic Party. He thinks they're all... See, in fact, I was talking to one of our diplomats who's worked in the US, a retired diplomat the other day who has met many of these guys. He says this Biden, what their Secretary of State, he says, yes, some mediocre fellows say. They are like your second-rate politicians. They are not thinking beyond the nose. So Biden's entire focus is winning these primary elections in November. He's not thinking about the world and future of the world. I will win the next election, which is understandable for a politician. On your second part, I think this is something which I should have mentioned in my remarks, which is India's own response, geopolitical response. I think has been very smart. I mean, I am a complete supporter of the positions that India has taken in the last 5 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I've written a series of columns in the Times of India as well as in the Deccan Chronicle. And if you read all of them, I've been a consistent supporter of this for 2 reasons.
One, as Kissinger has said, don't allow Russia and China to come too close. But two, the so-called great power rivalry is between the East and the West. Why should we, the countries of the South, get involved? There is nothing at stake for us. You think calmly and coolly about what does India want? India is a country of 1.2 billion people. Right now, we have enough food for our people. We need energy. We get it from West Asia. We can get it from Iran, we can get it from Venezuela, we can get it from countries which are not great friends of the United States. The United States is preventing us from buying enough from Iran and Venezuela, and we are buying from the US. Same with defense. The whole Indo-US defense deal is about buying less from Russia and buying more from US. So these are all economic deals. So therefore, our position, independent position, in my judgment, is extremely well thought out. I would give full marks to Foreign Minister Jaishankar. I think the guy has thought these things through and succeeded in convincing the Prime Minister, whose own foreign policy experience is very limited. He was never in Delhi all his life as a chief minister. But I think he has been well educated by Jaishankar. Our involvement in the other groups is a way of telling the West that we have other friends. So right now we are in a Quad with the US, Australia and Japan. We are in SCO with Russia, China and the Central Asian republics. We are in BRICS with Brazil, South Africa and Russia. We are in J with JAI, which is Japan, America, India trilateral. We are in RICS, which is Russia, India, China trilateral, RIC. So I keep joking in Delhi, everybody is applying for membership of all the clubs. I want to be in this club, I want to be in that club. I don't know how many clubs there are in Bangalore. But in Delhi, there are half a dozen clubs and people want to be everywhere. But if you're a really busy person, you have no time for any club, right? But you want to go around saying, oh, I'm a member of India International Center, I'm a member of India Habitat Center, I'm a member of Golf Club, I'm a member of this club. India is right now in that position. To go around saying, I'm a member of all the clubs. But we are not members of any trade club, which is what I had said earlier. And that is our biggest problem. These are all talk shops. What is SCO? What is Quad? What has Quad done? They all meet and talk. SCO meet and talk. They are not defense alliance, military alliances. They are not economic alliances. IPF came out of Quad and we have walked out of the trade section. So on trade we are isolated. On the real stuff we are isolated. But on manufacturing and all, I think I did answer all of that in my lecture. I won't repeat myself. Are there any other questions?
So just a follow-up question.
Okay. Yeah. I was before you, I think. You were told also. Wing Commander Butt, Doctor, excellent talk, good perspective from your side. Before I ask my question for you to highlight, I'd like to give you a little background of my perspective, how I see things, just so that the audience and you can understand. I went to Bishop Cotton School here, so the kind of history that we learn there is not the real history. And then I went to the National Defense Academy, where there was a deep learning of military history, geopolitics, etc. Became a fighter pilot, then choppers, went for the war in Sri Lanka, where I actually saw a war. And then I left the Air Force after Glacier and everything and flew offshore in Bombay, where the company secretary in that place said, you know who runs this country? It's the Reliance. And when I was flying offshore on the East Coast, there was a huge amount of gas out there, and Reliance had let the ONGC do the whole work, and then they took over. So the point number one is, the root cause of all the problems in this country is the leadership and corruption at all levels, stemming from the top. If you have a clean leadership, if the general is clean, the soldiers don't mind dying in the war. The second aspect is something which came out in today's newspaper. In Shimoga, for Ganesha, they put Godse's photo there. Nobody has read Hegdewar's vision of why he set it up. And nobody has read Godse about why he killed Gandhi going out of the law. He shouldn't have done it. There was no question. But a lot of people I meet say, okay, because he was going for partition. He never was. He was, as per Godse, appeasing the Muslims. So I would like your comment, Doctor, on these two aspects of everywhere in the schools, we don't have the correct perspective of our history and nationalism, which would reduce social tensions, and we have this lack of character in terms of corruption. Thank you.
Well, sir, it's outside the scope of my lecture, and one can have lots of views on these issues, so I will not devote too much time except to say that, yes, I mean, we have a crony capitalism, we have the cornering of wealth, inequality has gone up. India has produced more billionaires in the last 20 years than many other countries, including China, and yet there is poverty. And I've written about all this in my books. So we are an unequal society, we have lots of problems. But the point I'm making, sir, and I'll repeat this because this is important to understand. Despite all the problems, we have done reasonably well till 2015, which is why I started with those 4 numbers. Never forget, 3.5, 5.5, 7.5. That was the story of a rising India. Poverty went down sharply in the first 10 years of this century, from 2000 to 2010. 3 prime ministers, P.V. Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and Manmohan Singh, from 1991 to 2014, 3 prime ministers provided political stability, during which period we had the highest rate of average economic growth of 7.5%. The world looked at India and said, these guys, despite their democracy, despite all their problems which you mentioned, despite corruption, despite inequality, despite caste, despite communal tension, India has all these problems. Despite everything, there's something happening here. Which is why Lee Kuan Yew wrote in 2007 that Asia is a jet rising with 2 engines, one is China, the other is India. He equated us with China as recently as 2007. Today, nobody equates us with China, nobody. They are in a different league. We lived in a bipolar world when there was Soviet Union and the United States. We are back into a bipolar world in which there is China and the United States. I've written a long academic essay which was published in a Russian journal. It is available in the English language. The Institute for Defense Studies has published it in their book last year. Since you are in the services, you can get hold of it, where I talk about a bi-multipolar world. That this is not a bipolar world, like the Cold War, which was a bipolar world, that US and Russia, and then everybody else was below, right? But today, that's not the case. You have China and the US, but the others are big enough to make a difference. So which are the middle powers? Russia, India, Brazil, Japan, Germany, France. Well, I would have said Britain, till Britain surrendered, got out of EU and became 51st state of the United States. But these are all the independent middle powers. France has a concept of strategic autonomy like we do. It has an independent foreign policy. Germany has an independent foreign policy as long as Angela Merkel was there. And that is what I said. Scholz has gone and surrendered to the Americans. But German politics will evolve. Brazil will re-elect Lula in November. And Lula is, another man who will stand up for Brazil, unlike this joker Bolsonaro, who also went and surrendered to the Americans. Political leaderships change and countries acquire new personality. So the point I'm making is we are in a bi-multipolar world, in which we have space. How we make use of that space is our challenge. And I hope that, we learn as we go along. But thank you very much for your patience. I think I'm 6:15.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baru, for a fascinating session. And thanks to the wonderful audience and all the questions that came up. I want to say that in the coming months, with the revival of the Azim Premji University Public Lecture Series, we have a lecture planned in November by Professor Makarand Paranjpe. And in December, we'll have Mr. Jagannathan of Swarajya speaking to us that will be in December, I think December 19th or so. So November is Makarand Paranjpe, and December will be Mr. Jagannathan. Thank you very much. And once again, Dr. Baru, thank you so much for coming here and reactivating the public lecture series. Thank you, everybody.